The galactic monitoring station Theta 7 had stood silent for 3,000 years, its crystalline arrays pointed toward the dead zones of the galaxy's outer spiral arm. The station was a relic from an age of caution, built by the concordat of 12 species, when the galaxy was young and full of uncertainty.
Now it served primarily as a historical monument, staffed by a skeleton crew of bored technicians who spent their shifts playing strategy games and counting down the cycles until retirement.
Senior Monitor Krelveth, a serpentine being with iridescent scales that shifted from deep violet to pale silver with his mood, had served at Theta 7 for 40 standard rotations. In all that time, nothing of consequence had ever happened. The dead zones remained dead, as they had been since the Great Silence began 8,000 years ago.
That changed on the morning of the third cycle, in the season of long shadows.
Senior Monitor. The voice of his subordinate, a young Methani named Turris, crackled through the communication system. You should see this.
Krelveth stretched his coils and slithered toward the primary observation chamber, his scales flickering with mild annoyance. Turris was fresh from the academy, prone to excitement over cosmic background fluctuations and rogue asteroid trajectories.
What is it now? Krelveth asked as he entered the chamber. Another pulsar variation? Turris stood frozen before the holographic display, her 4 arms hanging limply at her sides. The young Methani's gray skin had turned almost white, and her compound eyes were fixed on a single point in the 3-dimensional star map that dominated the room.
Signal, she whispered, coming from the quarantine zone.
Krelveth felt his hearts, all 3 of them, skip a beat. Impossible! The quarantine zone has been dead since before the Concordat was formed. There's nothing there but the remains of the Architect civilization and—
Not the Architect worlds, Turris interrupted, something that would normally have earned a sharp rebuke. From further out, from the 3rd planet of a yellow star designated Sol 7291. The name meant nothing to Krelveth, which was itself strange. He knew every cataloged system in his sector, had memorized them as part of his training centuries ago. He accessed the station's database, his neural interface flickering as it pulled the relevant files. What he found made his scales turn pure white.
Classification, seeded world, he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. Status, quarantined. Priority level, extinction class threat. Do not approach. Do not respond. Do not acknowledge.
What does that mean? Turris asked. I've never heard of such a classification.
Krelveth stared at the file, at the dates attached to it. The quarantine order was older than the Concordat itself, older than recorded galactic history. It had been issued by the Architects, the mysterious precursor race that had vanished 8,000 years ago, leaving behind nothing but ruins and warnings.
Play the signal, Krelveth said. The chamber filled with sound, not the mathematical precision of a beacon or the structured patterns of standard communication protocols. This was something else entirely, something that made Krelveth's survival instincts scream in ancient terror. It was music.
A voice, singular and haunting, rose and fell in patterns that spoke of emotion, of longing, of a desperate need to reach out across the void. Accompanying it were instruments that wove together in impossible complexity, creating a tapestry of sound that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying.
What is that? Turris whispered. I don't know, Krelveth admitted. But it's directed outward. They're not just sending signals, they're announcing themselves. To whom? Krelveth thought of the Architects, of their ancient warnings, of the dead zones they had left behind. He thought of the Great Silence, of the 100 species that had simply vanished from the galaxy without explanation or trace. He thought of the Concordat's most sacred laws, the ones that every civilization agreed upon regardless of their differences.
Never seed a world with sapient potential and leave it unmonitored.
Never allow a species to develop in isolation. Never, under any circumstances, let them reach for the stars alone.
Contact the Concordate High Council, Krelveth said, his voice steadier than he felt. Priority Alpha. Tell them the seeded world in Sector 7291 has awakened. Tell them the humans are sending signals.
The High Council of the Concordate of 12 Species had not held an emergency session in over 500 years. The last one had concerned a rogue asteroid that threatened the homeworld of the Velan hegemony, a crisis that had been resolved with a few well-placed gravitational manipulators and minimal fuss.
This was different. The Council Chamber, located in the heart of the ancient station known as the Nexus, was filled to capacity. Representatives from all 12 species sat in their designated sections, their translators working overtime as dozens of languages overlapped in rising panic. The viewing galleries, normally empty, were packed with observers from every major civilization in the Concordate. High Speaker Zethrin, the elected leader of the council, struck the ancient tone crystal 3 times, and silence fell across the chamber. Zethrin was a Salathi, a species of tall, willowy beings with skin that seemed to shift between dimensions, making them appear slightly out of focus to most other races. This emergency session of the High Council is now in order, Zethrin announced, their voice resonating through the chamber. We are here to address the signal received by monitoring station Theta 7 approximately 17 cycles ago. I now call upon Director Krelveth to present his findings.
Krelveth slithered forward to the central platform, acutely aware of the thousands of eyes fixed upon him. He had been promoted to director in the chaos following his initial report, a promotion he hadn't wanted and that felt more like a punishment than an honor.
Honored council members, he began, what I am about to share with you represents the most significant threat to galactic stability since the Great Silence. He activated the holographic display, and the chamber filled with a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy. A single point of light pulsed red in the outer spiral arm, the location of the Sol system.
For those unfamiliar with the history, Sol 7291 is a yellow dwarf star located in what we call the quarantine zone. 8,000 years ago, the architects, the precursor race that created much of the technology we still rely on today, designated this region as forbidden. The records they left behind are fragmentary, but they all contain the same warning.
He pulled up the ancient text, letting the translation algorithms render it in the common tongue. The third world of Sol 7291 has been seeded with potential. We have failed in our duty to guide them. By the time we realized our error, they had already become something we did not anticipate. They are not like the others. They do not respond to the protocols. They resist. They adapt. They endure. We cannot contain them, and we cannot destroy them without destroying ourselves. Our only option is to leave and pray that isolation will accomplish what we could not.
If they ever reach for the stars, if they ever send signals into the void, then the galaxy must know.
Krelveth paused, his scales rippling with unease.
Run.
The chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates shouted questions, accusations, and demands. Some called for immediate military action, others for diplomatic outreach. A few simply sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process the implications. High Speaker Zethrin struck the tone crystal again. Order! There will be order in this chamber. Slowly, the noise subsided. Director Krelveth, Zethrin said, you mentioned that the signal received was not a standard beacon. Can you elaborate? Yes, High Speaker. The signal was a form of cultural transmission, specifically a radio broadcast, containing what we believe to be artistic expression. Music, as some species call it. Music? The Velan representative, a massive crystalline being that communicated through subsonic vibrations, pulsed with confusion. They sent art into space?
They did more than that, Kralveth said. Based on our analysis of the signal's origin and the technology required to produce it, we believe this was not an intentional communication attempt. It was simply a broadcast, entertainment perhaps, or cultural expression that happened to leak into space. They may not even know it escaped their world.
Then why the concern? Asked the Methani delegate, an elder of Taurus's species. If they are not intentionally reaching out, surely there is time to—
Because that was 17 cycles ago, Kralveth interrupted. Since then, we have detected over 40,000 additional signals from the Sol system. They are not just leaking radio waves anymore. They are actively sending probes into space. They have left their world and walked on their moon. They have sent machines to explore their star system. He zoomed the display in on the Sol system, highlighting the numerous artificial objects that the Concordat sensors had detected. In the time since we first detected their signals, they have advanced from simple radio transmission to interplanetary exploration. Based on their rate of technological progress, our projections indicate they will be capable of interstellar travel within 200 standard years.
200 years? The Helix Confederacy's representative, a hive mind species that spoke through a single designated drone, buzzed with alarm. That is nothing. Our own species took 3,000 years to make the same progression.
And that is precisely the problem, Kralveth said. Humans, that is their name for themselves, do not develop like other species. They do not follow the standard progression. They leap forward in bursts of innovation, often driven by conflict with each other.
Conflict with each other? High Speaker Zethrin's form flickered with disturbed. They engage in intraspecies warfare?
Extensively. From what we can determine through their signals, warfare has been a constant throughout their history. They have killed millions of their own kind, developed weapons capable of rendering their planet uninhabitable, and come within moments of using them on multiple occasions.
The chamber fell silent. In all of galactic history, no sapient species had ever been known to develop world-ending weapons while still confined to a single planet. The very concept was antithetical to survival. Any species that did so would surely destroy itself before reaching the stars.
And yet, Kralveth continued, they did not. Despite having the capability to annihilate themselves for over 60 of their years, they have refrained. They continue to advance, continue to grow, continue to reach outward.
This is madness, declared the Triumvirate of Ash, a trio of beings that ruled the volcanic worlds of the inner core. You describe a species that is simultaneously suicidal and unstoppable. Such a thing cannot exist.
I describe what the evidence shows us, Kralveth replied. And there is more.
He activated another display, this one showing a series of images captured by long-range observation drones that had been dispatched to the Sol system in the days following the initial signal detection.
These are visual records of human activity. What you are seeing is their planet, Earth, they call it.
The image showed a blue-green world, covered in vast oceans and swirling cloud patterns. It was beautiful in a way that made Kralveth's hearts ache, and terrifying because of what he knew lived there.
Population, approximately 8 billion individuals.
A ripple of shock passed through the chamber. 8 billion was more than most species achieved across their entire civilization, spread across multiple worlds. For a single planet to support such numbers was unprecedented.
They have divided themselves into competing factions, what they call nations. These nations frequently engage in conflict, but they also cooperate when faced with common threats. They have survived extinction-level events that would have eliminated most species: asteroid impacts, ice ages, plagues, self-inflicted environmental damage, and each time they have emerged stronger.
"How is this possible?" asked the Elder of the Singing Stones, a silicon-based life form that had been observing the proceedings in crystalline silence. "Our models of civilizational development show that such a species should have destroyed itself long ago."
We don't know, Kralveth admitted, but there is a hypothesis. Among the fragmented architect records, there is mention of why the seeding of Earth went wrong. They called it a miscalculation.
What kind of miscalculation? Krell hesitated. This was the part of his presentation he had been dreading, the part that made no sense, that violated everything the Concordat understood about the universe.
The architects believed that sapience was a single trait, one that could be cultivated through careful genetic manipulation over millions of years. They seeded worlds with the building blocks of intelligence, then returned periodically to guide the developing species toward enlightenment. This is how all 12 species of the Concordat came to be. We are all, in a sense, children of the architects.
He paused, letting that sink in.
But Earth was different. When the architects seeded the planet, they introduced multiple competing lines of development. Dozens of species showed sapient potential. They expected the strongest line to dominate and the others to fade away, as had happened on every other seeded world.
What happened instead? One line did dominate, the line that became humanity. But they did not dominate through superiority of intelligence or physical prowess. They dominated because they were the most aggressive, the most adaptable, the most ruthlessly competitive. They drove every other sapient potential species to extinction, hunted them down and killed them, until only humanity remained.
The chamber was utterly silent now. Even the atmospheric processors seemed to have stopped, holding their breath along with everyone else. The architects realized their mistake too late. By the time they returned to guide humanity's development, the humans had already developed their own forms of civilization, crude, violent, but undeniably effective. When the architects attempted to intervene, to shape humanity as they had shaped other species, they met resistance.
Resistance from a pre-technological species?
Yes, the records are unclear on exactly what happened, but the architects describe a period of conflict that lasted several thousand years. Every attempt to guide, manipulate, or control humanity failed. They could not be uplifted because they did not want to be uplifted. They could not be pacified because violence was fundamental to their nature. They could not be contained because they always found a way to escape.
And so the architects abandoned them, High Speaker Zethrin said softly. They ran, as their own warning advised others to do. Yes, and then shortly after, the architects vanished. The Great Silence began. And for 8,000 years, the galaxy believed that Earth was just another dead world in a dead zone.
But now they're awake, the Valen representative rumbled, and they're reaching for the stars.
Krell nodded slowly. Now they're awake. And based on what we know of their history, their psychology, and their capabilities, we need to decide what to do about it.
The council debated for 17 cycles without reaching a consensus. The first proposal came from the triumvirate of Ash, predictably calling for immediate military action, a preemptive strike, they argued, before humanity developed interstellar capabilities. Sterilize the Sol system, destroy any evidence of the species, and seal the quarantine zone permanently.
The proposal died quickly. Even setting aside the moral implications, which many species were willing to do, the practical challenges were insurmountable. The Sol system was surrounded by the remnants of the Architect quarantine, ancient automated defenses that still functioned after 8,000 years. Any fleet that approached would be destroyed long before it reached Earth.
We could disable the defenses, suggested the Helix Confederacy. Given time, our engineers could... Given time, interrupted the Elder of the Singing Stones, the humans will advance further. Do you propose to race against them, hoping to destroy them before they can retaliate?
They are confined to a single planet. What retaliation could they possibly...
They developed weapons capable of destroying their world while still believing they were alone in the universe, the Elder replied. What do you imagine they would create if they knew we were coming to kill them?
The second proposal came from the Salathi delegation, suggesting diplomatic contact. If the architects' methods of control had failed, perhaps a different approach would succeed. Offer the humans membership in the Concordat, integrate them into galactic society, give them a stake in maintaining peace and stability.
You propose to invite a species with 8 billion individuals and a history of genocide into our community? The triumvirate's flames flickered with disbelief. They would overwhelm us within generations. Their numbers alone would give them a dominant voice in the council.
Then we establish limitations, the Salathi representative replied. Population controls, technological restrictions, supervised development. And when they refuse to accept these limitations, when they resist, as they resisted the architects.
The Salathi had no answer. The third proposal, from the Singing Stones, was perhaps the most unusual: do nothing. The quarantine had held for 8,000 years. The architect defenses remained active. Perhaps the best course of action was simply to wait and observe, gathering more information before making any decisions.
Wait for what? Demanded the Methani delegate. For them to develop weapons that can bypass the quarantine? For them to find us before we decide how to respond?
For them to destroy themselves, the elder replied calmly. You say they have come close to self-annihilation many times. Perhaps they will finally succeed. Perhaps the problem will solve itself.
And if it doesn't, if they reach the stars, as Director Krelveth predicts, and we have done nothing to prepare?
Then we will face the consequences of our inaction, but at least we will face them with more knowledge than we have now.
The debate continued, around and around, with no resolution in sight.
It was on the 18th cycle that everything changed.
Krelveth was in his quarters, reviewing the latest intelligence from the Sol system, when his communication panel activated with an emergency priority signal.
Director, you need to come to the observation center immediately. The voice belonged to Turris, who had been assigned to his staff after the initial discovery. Something's happening.
He found her standing before a new holographic display, this one showing a real-time feed from the monitoring station's deep space sensors. What he saw made his scales turn pure white for the second time in his life.
A ship was approaching the quarantine zone.
It was unlike anything in the Concordat's registry, a massive construct of metal and ceramic, trailing a plume of superheated plasma from its primitive reaction drives. It moved slowly compared to the Concordat's vessels, but it moved with purpose, on a direct course for interstellar space.
That's not possible, Krelveth whispered. Our projections said they were 200 years from.
They accelerated, Turris said. We don't know how or why, but our latest analysis shows massive increases in their technological output over the past decade. They've achieved fusion power, advanced computing, material science that our engineers are still trying to understand.
Where is it going?
Turris manipulated the display, tracing the ship's trajectory. Proxima Centauri, the nearest star system to their own. They're sending an exploration vessel.
How long until it arrives? At its current speed, approximately 70 of their years.
70 years, a blink of an eye in galactic terms. Long enough for a full council debate, but nowhere near long enough to prepare for the implications.
There's more, Turris said. We've intercepted communications from the vessel. They're calling it the Hope of Humanity.
She played the intercepted audio, and the chamber filled with human voices. Krelveth listened, struggling to understand their language, despite the translation algorithms working at full capacity. Embarking on the greatest journey in human history, we go not as representatives of any nation, but as representatives of our entire species. Whatever we find out there, whatever challenges we face them together.
They sound optimistic, Krelveth said.
They sound terrifying, Turris replied. Director, look at the ship's cargo manifest. We managed to decode part of their transmission logs.
The display changed, showing a list of items aboard the Hope of Humanity. Scientific equipment, habitation modules, food production systems, all expected for an exploration vessel. But at the bottom of the list, marked with what appeared to be special priority designations, was something else.
Weapons. Not just personal sidearms or defensive systems.
The manifest included military-grade armaments, ground combat vehicles, and something that the translation algorithms struggled to parse.
Nuclear warheads, Turris translated quietly. They're carrying weapons capable of destroying a planet.
On an exploration vessel? They don't know what they'll find. They're preparing for the worst.
Krelveth stared at the display, at the tiny dot of light that represented humanity's first step toward the stars. In that moment, he understood why the architects had run. It wasn't just that humanity was aggressive or dangerous or unpredictable. It was that they approached the universe with a mindset that no other species could comprehend.
They expected hostility. They prepared for war. And they refused to let fear stop them from reaching for what they wanted.
Alert the Council, he said finally. Tell them we've run out of time for debate.
The Concordat's response to the hope of humanity was, in retrospect, a masterpiece of political compromise that satisfied no one and accomplished nothing. They dispatched an observation fleet to shadow the human vessel at a safe distance, close enough to monitor, far enough to avoid detection. The fleet's commander, Admiral Thesson of the Valen hegemony, was given strict orders. Observe only, do not interfere, report all findings immediately to the Council. For the first decade, the mission was almost boring. The hope of humanity traveled in a straight line, making no course corrections, sending no signals that suggested awareness of their observers. The humans aboard the vessels spent their time in what appeared to be suspended animation, with only a small crew maintaining the ship's systems. Admiral Thesson, a being of crystal and living metal, used the time to study everything the Concordat knew about humanity. He read Director Krelveth's reports, reviewed the architect warnings, and analyzed every scrap of data from the monitoring stations. By the end of the first decade, he considered himself the Concordat's foremost expert on human behavior. He was wrong. The incident occurred in the 43rd year of the voyage, when the hope of humanity was approximately 3/4 of the way to its destination. Admiral Thesson was in his command chamber, reviewing routine sensor data, when his tactical officers signaled an alert. "Admiral, the human vessel is changing course." Thesson's crystalline form pulsed with surprise. Changing course? Toward what? Toward us. For a long moment, Thesson simply stared at the tactical display. The Concordinate fleet had maintained a minimum distance of half a light-year from the human ship, using advanced stealth technology that should have been completely undetectable to their primitive sensors. "That's impossible. They don't have the capability to—"
"They're accelerating," the tactical officer interrupted, "and they've begun transmitting."
The communication came through the Concordat's translation systems, rendered in the flat, emotionless tones of the automated interpreter.
"Attention, unknown vessels. We have detected your presence and tracked your movements for the past 43 years. We are the hope of humanity, representing the United Nations of Earth. We do not know who you are or why you have been following us, but we can no longer pretend we haven't noticed. Please respond. We come in peace, but we are prepared to defend ourselves if necessary." Thesson felt something he had never experienced before. Genuine fear. Not the abstract concern that had filled the council chambers, not the intellectual understanding that humanity was dangerous. This was primal, instinctive terror, the knowledge that he had been watched without knowing it, that his every move had been observed and analyzed.
"How did they know?" he demanded. "Our stealth systems are infallible. No technology at their level should be able to—"
"Admiral," the tactical officer's voice was barely a whisper, "they didn't detect us with technology. They observed us."
"What?"
"I've analyzed their tracking data based on their transmissions. They've been watching for any anomalies in the background radiation, any fluctuations in starlight, any patterns that suggested something was following them. They used mathematics, Admiral. They calculated where we had to be based on the impossibility of their situation."
The impossibility of their situation?
They reasoned that if they were truly alone in the universe, their mission would be pointless. If they were not alone, then someone would be watching. They looked for watchers, and they found us.
Admiral Thesson understood then what the architects had meant in their warnings. It wasn't that humanity was more intelligent or more powerful than other species. It was that they thought differently. They approached problems from angles that other minds never considered. They assumed nothing, trusted nothing, and prepared for everything.
And they had been playing a very, very long game.
Respond to their transmission, Thesson ordered. Tell them we represent the Galactic Concordat, and we welcome them to the stars.
The response came within minutes, far faster than the light speed delay should have allowed. The humans had anticipated this moment, had prepared for it, and had positioned their communication systems to minimize any delay.
Galactic Concordat, thank you for your response. We have many questions, but one stands above all others. Why have you been watching us in secret? Why did you not make contact earlier?
Admiral Thesson considered the question, considered all the possible answers he could give. The truth, that the Concordat had been debating whether to destroy humanity or contain them or simply ignore them, seemed unwise. A diplomatic fiction, that the Concordat had only recently discovered the hope of humanity, would insult their intelligence.
In the end, he chose honesty. "We were afraid of you," he transmitted. "We have observed your species for many generations. We have seen your capacity for violence, your resistance to guidance, your relentless drive to expand and conquer." The Concordat was uncertain how to proceed.
The pause that followed was longer this time. When the human response came, it was different from what Thesson expected.
"We understand. We would have felt the same way in your position. Perhaps we can help address your concerns. We propose a meeting, face-to-face as your species allows, to discuss the future. We have much to learn from each other."
Against every protocol, against every instinct screaming in his crystalline mind, Admiral Thesson agreed.
The meeting took place aboard the Hope of Humanity at the humans' insistence. They argued that their vessel was more suited to accommodating multiple species, an argument that made no sense until Admiral Thesson saw the ship's interior for the first time.
The Hope of Humanity was not just an exploration vessel. It was an ark.
The sleeping chambers that Thesson had observed from a distance contained not just crew members in suspended animation, but representatives of every aspect of human culture. Scientists, artists, philosophers, warriors, leaders, every type of human that their species had to offer. The cargo holds contained not just supplies and weapons, but seeds, genetic samples, cultural artifacts, and historical records.
"We didn't know what we would find," explained Captain Elena Vasquez, the mission commander. She was a small woman by human standards, with dark skin and graying hair that spoke of decades of experience. "We didn't know if we would ever return to Earth, so we brought Earth with us."
You expected to establish a colony? Thesson asked.
"We expected to adapt to whatever we found. Colony, outpost, trading station, embassy. We prepared for every possibility, including war." Captain Vasquez met his crystalline gaze without flinching. "Including war. We've read your transmissions, Admiral. We know the Concordat considered destroying us. We know some of your species still favor that option. We would be fools not to prepare for the possibility that this meeting ends in violence."
And if it does?
Then we will fight. We will lose. We understand the technological gap between our civilizations, but we will make you remember us. We will make sure that when you tell stories of this day, you speak of the hope of humanity with respect.
Thesson had negotiated with dozens of species over his long career. He had faced threats, ultimatums, and displays of power, but he had never encountered anything like this, a species that acknowledged its own weakness while simultaneously promising to make victory cost more than it was worth. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you refuse to simply accept your situation? You are one species among dozens, confined to a single world, thousands of years behind us in development. Why do you not simply submit, accept guidance, allow yourselves to be integrated into our civilization?"
Captain Vasquez smiled, a human expression that Thesson's databases identified as indicating both amusement and something else, something his translators struggled to parse.
Do you know the history of our world, Admiral?
I have read Director Krelveth's reports.
Then you know that humanity has faced extinction many times. Ice ages, plagues, wars, environmental collapse. Each time there were those who counseled submission, accept the inevitable, bow to forces greater than ourselves, let the strong survive and the weak perish.
And yet, you survived. We survived because we refused to accept. We fought the ice, we conquered disease, we turned our weapons into tools and our enemies into allies. We clawed our way from caves to cities to stars, not because we were the strongest or the smartest, but because we never, ever gave up.
She leaned forward, and for a moment Thesson saw something in her eyes that made him understand, truly understand, the architect's warnings.
You ask why we don't submit to the Concordat's guidance. The answer is simple, because submission is death. Not physical death, but something worse, the death of what makes us human. We have spent our entire history learning to master ourselves, to channel our aggression into creation, to transform our capacity for destruction into a force for growth. If we surrender that journey, if we let others define our path, we lose everything that brought us this far. But the Concordat has much to offer: technology, knowledge, peace.
Peace. Captain Vasquez laughed, a sound that Thesson's translators identified as bitter. Your Concordat has maintained peace for 3,000 years. In that time, how many new species have joined your community?
Thesson calculated. 17 worlds have been elevated to membership status. And how many have emerged on their own? How many have reached the stars without guidance, without intervention, without someone else deciding when and how they were ready? The answer, Thesson realized, was none. The Concordat's primary function was to manage the development of seeded worlds, to guide emerging species toward enlightenment at a pace that ensured stability. No species in 3,000 years had developed independently. You see, Captain Vasquez continued, your peace comes at a cost. You've created a galaxy where no one grows without permission, where no one takes risks without approval, where the only acceptable path is the one that's already been walked. That's not peace, it's stagnation. And humanity offers an alternative? Humanity offers chaos, uncertainty, conflict, but also innovation, growth, change. We don't know what we're becoming, Admiral. We only know that we're becoming something new, something that has never existed before. And we'd rather face that unknown future than accept a certain present defined by others. Admiral Thesson contemplated her words for a long time. In the silence, he became aware of the ship around him, the hum of its engines, the whisper of its life support systems, the subtle vibrations that spoke of a vessel built by beings who had never traveled between stars before, who had taught themselves everything they knew through trial and error and sheer stubborn refusal to quit. The Council will not accept this, he said finally. They fear what humanity represents. They will seek to contain you, control you, or destroy you.
We know.
And yet, you still chose to make contact.
We chose to make contact because the alternative was worse. Hiding, waiting, hoping you wouldn't notice us, that's not who we are. We'd rather face our fate directly, know what we're up against, and make our own choices about how to respond.
Thesson rose from his seat, his crystalline form refracting the ship's artificial light into rainbow patterns. I will report to the Council. I will tell them what you have told me. I cannot predict how they will respond.
We don't ask you to predict, Captain Vasquez said. We only ask you to understand. And to remember, when the Council debates what to do about humanity, that we are not a problem to be solved. We are a species to be encountered. Whatever happens next, we want it to be a choice made with full knowledge, not a reaction born of fear.
A reasonable request. Thassin moved toward the door, then paused. One final question, Captain. The music we detected, the first signal that alerted us to your existence, what was it?
Captain Vasquez smiled again, and this time the expression held genuine warmth. It was called Voyager's Golden Record. We sent it into space over a century ago, attached to one of our first interstellar probes. It contained greetings in dozens of languages, images of our world, and music from cultures across our planet.
Why?
Because we hoped someone would hear it. Because we wanted to share who we were with the universe, even if we never knew whether anyone was listening. Because... She paused, and Thesson saw something glistening in her eyes, something his databases identified as tears. Because we believe that life is too beautiful not to share.
Admiral Thesson left the hope of humanity with more questions than answers, and a growing suspicion that the Concordanat was about to face the greatest challenge in its 3,000-year history.
The Council's response to Admiral Thesson's report was, in many ways, predictable.
The Triumvirate of Ash demanded immediate military action, arguing that humanity's very existence was an existential threat that could not be tolerated. They pointed to the weapons aboard the Hope of Humanity, to Captain Vasquez's acknowledgement that humanity was prepared for war, as evidence that the species could never be trusted. The Salathi counseled patience, suggesting that further dialogue might reveal common ground. Perhaps, they argued, humanity's resistance to guidance stemmed from the architect's failures rather than any inherent trait. A new approach, based on respect and cooperation rather than control, might yield different results. The Singing Stones proposed a middle path, limited contact, carefully managed, with opportunities for both sides to learn from each other. They acknowledged that humanity was unlike any species the Concordat had encountered, and suggested that traditional approaches might not apply. The debate raged for weeks, with no consensus emerging. Meanwhile, the Hope of Humanity continued its journey toward Proxima Centauri, now openly communicating with the Concordat observation fleet that no longer pretended to be hidden.
It was during this period that something unexpected happened. The humans, denied membership in the Concordat and uncertain of their future, began to share. It started with cultural exchanges, music, art, literature, the accumulated creative output of 8 billion minds. The Hope of Humanity's databanks contained millions of hours of human expression, and Captain Vasquez offered it freely to any species that wished to receive it. At first, few accepted. The works seemed primitive, unpolished, lacking the mathematical precision that marked Concordat art. But those who did explore the human archives found something they had not expected: emotion. Human art was not about perfection. It was about feeling. A song could capture the ache of loss in a way that made listeners weep, regardless of species. A painting could evoke beauty so intense that it left observers changed. A story could explore the depths of human experience, love, fear, hope, despair, with a raw honesty that made the carefully structured narratives of Concordat culture seem hollow by comparison. The younger members of various species were the first to embrace human art. They copied the music, studied the paintings, read the stories. They found something in human expression that their own cultures lacked: a willingness to be imperfect, to fail, to try again, to never stop reaching for something just beyond their grasp. And they began to change.
The first sign came from the Methani, when a group of young artists petitioned their government for permission to create works in the human style, rough, emotional, unconstrained by traditional forms. The petition was denied, but the works were created anyway, circulated through underground channels, sparking debates about the nature of art and expression. The second sign came from the Velen hegemony, when a faction of engineers proposed adapting human technologies, primitive but clever, for use in Concordat vessels. The proposal highlighted aspects of human design that the Concordat had overlooked: redundancy, simplicity, adaptability. Human ships were less efficient than Concordat vessels, but they were also more robust, more repairable, more likely to survive unexpected challenges.
The third sign came from the Salathi themselves, when a philosopher published a treatise on human concepts of freedom and self-determination. The work argued that the Concordat's approach to emerging species, guiding them, controlling their development, deciding when they were ready for independence, was fundamentally flawed.
Species that were uplifted never developed the resilience that came from struggle, the innovation that came from necessity, the spirit that came from earning their place among the stars. The treatise sparked a controversy that threatened to tear the Salathi civilization apart, with conservatives calling for its suppression and progressives hailing it as the most important philosophical work in millennia.
All of this happened in the span of a single generation, a blink of an eye by galactic standards, but long enough for the Concordat to realize that humanity's influence was spreading whether they liked it or not. When the High Council reconvened to address the human question, the situation had changed dramatically. No longer were they debating how to contain or control humanity. Now they were debating how to respond to a galaxy that was already being transformed by human ideas.
High Speaker Zethrin called the session to order with a heavy heart. The debates of the past months had aged even a Salathi, and the decision before the council seemed impossible.
"We face a choice," Zethrin announced, "that will determine the future of our civilization. The species known as humanity has made clear its intention to take its place among the stars, with or without our approval. Our response to this intention will shape the galaxy for millennia to come."
Director Krelveth, who had remained involved in the human question despite numerous attempts to reassign him, was called to present the current situation.
In the 72 cycles since the hope of humanity made contact with Admiral Thesson's fleet, we have observed rapid changes throughout the Concordat. Human cultural artifacts have spread to every member species, despite official restrictions on their distribution. Human ideas about freedom, self-determination, and the right of species to chart their own course have taken root in ways we did not anticipate.
He activated a holographic display showing the Sol system, now pulsing with activity.
More concerning, humanity has not been idle during our deliberations. They have launched 12 additional vessels toward nearby star systems. They have established a permanent presence on their moon and begun mining operations on several asteroids. Their population has increased by another 1 billion individuals. Their technological capabilities have advanced by what our analysts estimate as 200 years of typical development, achieved in less than 1 century.
"How is such rapid advancement possible?" demanded the triumvirate.
"Competition," Krelveth replied. "Humanity's various factions are racing to establish claims in space, each trying to outdo the others. This competition drives innovation at rates we have never observed in any species. What takes us millennia to develop, they achieve in decades."
"All the more reason to stop them now," the triumvirate insisted, "before they become truly dangerous."
"With respect," Krelveth said, "I believe they are already dangerous, but not in the way we feared." He changed the display to show a map of conquered space, with numerous points highlighted throughout.
These represent worlds where human ideas have taken hold. Worlds where young beings are questioning the old orders, demanding changes, pushing for innovation and growth that our civilizations have not experienced in millennia. Humanity has not invaded our galaxy with weapons. They have invaded it with concepts, and concepts cannot be destroyed by force.
The elder of the singing stones spoke, their crystalline voice resonating through the chamber. "Then what do you propose?"
Krelveth hesitated. What he was about to say would likely end his career, might even result in his exile from the Concordat. But after years of studying humanity, of watching them, of learning to understand them, he had come to a conclusion he could no longer deny.
"I propose that we let them in."
The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted objections, demands for clarification, accusations of betrayal. High Speaker Zethrin struck the tone crystal repeatedly, but order was slow to return.
Explain, Zethrin finally commanded.
The Concordat was built on a foundation of control, Krelveth said. We guide developing species because we fear what they might become if left to their own devices. We restrict innovation because we fear where it might lead. We maintain peace because we fear the alternative. But humanity has shown us a different path, a path of embracing uncertainty, of accepting risk, of trusting in the future even when that future is unknown.
That path leads to chaos, the triumvirate snarled.
Perhaps, but it also leads to growth. In the 72 cycles since we discovered humanity, our galaxy has experienced more change than in the previous 3,000 years. Not all of that change has been comfortable, but it has forced us to examine ourselves, to question our assumptions, to consider possibilities we had long since dismissed.
You're suggesting we abandon everything we've built.
I'm suggesting we allow it to evolve. The architects made a mistake when they tried to control humanity. They assumed that their way was the only way, that any species that didn't follow their model was a threat. We've been making the same mistake. But humanity has survived, thrived, by following a different path. Perhaps there's room in the galaxy for more than one approach.
The debate that followed was long and painful, with every species weighing in on both sides. The triumvirate and their allies advocated for immediate action, arguing that delay only made the problem worse. The Salathi and their faction pushed for continued dialogue, hoping to find common ground that might avoid conflict. But it was the Singing Stones who made the proposal that ultimately carried the day.
We have been speaking as though humanity is something to be managed, a problem, a threat, a challenge to be overcome. But perhaps we should consider a different perspective. Perhaps humanity is a gift.
A gift? The triumvirate's flames flickered with disbelief.
For 8,000 years, we have maintained order, stability, peace. We have built civilizations that span the galaxy, technologies that would seem like magic to lesser species, cultural achievements that will endure for eternity. And yet,
The elder paused, their crystalline form resonating with something that might have been sadness. And yet we have stopped growing. Our art has not changed in 1,000 years. Our philosophy has not advanced in 2,000. Our technology improves incrementally, but the great leaps of imagination that characterized our early development are long behind us. We have become comfortable, content, stagnant. You speak as though stagnation is a failure.
Is it not? What is the purpose of civilization if not to grow, to learn, to become something greater than what we were? The architects understood this once. They seeded the galaxy with potential, hoping to create a community of species that would push each other toward ever higher achievement. But somewhere along the way, we lost that vision. We became focused on control rather than collaboration, on maintaining what we had rather than striving for what we might become.
The elder turned toward the holographic display, where the Sol system still pulsed with activity.
Humanity remembers what we have forgotten. They still dream of the impossible. They still reach for what they cannot quite grasp. They still believe that tomorrow can be better than today, not because someone in authority tells them so, but because they refuse to accept any other possibility.
And if they destroy us in the process of pursuing those dreams, then perhaps we deserve to be destroyed. A civilization that cannot survive the challenge of a new idea is not worth preserving. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone expected. But in the end, the Concordat chose hope over fear.
Humanity would be welcomed into the galactic community, not as a species to be guided or controlled, but as an equal partner with the same rights and responsibilities as any other member. The process would be difficult, the adjustments painful, the conflicts inevitable. But for the first time in millennia, the galaxy was about to experience something it had long since forgotten.
Change. The integration of humanity into the Concordat was, as predicted, neither smooth nor simple.
The hope of humanity arrived at Proxima Centauri to find a welcoming committee of concorded vessels and a diplomatic delegation prepared to negotiate the terms of humanity's membership. Captain Vasquez, now the de facto ambassador of her species, approached the negotiations with the same directness that had characterized her meeting with Admiral Thesson.
"We're not going to follow rules designed for species that needed to be handheld through development," she said at the opening session. "We've spent our entire history learning to walk on our own, and we're not about to let someone else carry us now."
"The Concordat's regulations exist for good reason," replied the Salathi negotiator. "They prevent conflicts, ensure fair distribution of resources, maintain stability across thousands of worlds."
Your regulations also prevent innovation, stifle competition, and treat every problem as something to be managed rather than solved. We're not interested in being managed.
The negotiations lasted for years, Earth years, which were becoming the standard measure as human influence spread through the galaxy. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Humanity would join the Concordat as a special status member, bound by the core principles of non-aggression and resource sharing, but exempt from the developmental restrictions that governed other species. In exchange, humanity agreed to share its most valuable resource, itself.
The first humans to serve as advisors and consultants in other civilizations were carefully chosen: diplomats, scientists, artists, philosophers, selected for their ability to bridge the gap between human and non-human perspectives. They established themselves throughout Concordat space, bringing with them not just knowledge, but attitude.
The human approach to problems: attack them head-on, try multiple solutions simultaneously, fail fast and learn faster, began to infect the ancient, cautious civilizations they encountered.
Not everyone welcomed the change. The triumvirate of Ash withdrew from the Concordat entirely, declaring that they would have no part in what they called the contamination of the galaxy. They sealed their borders, cut off all communication, and retreated into isolation.
Others embraced the new order enthusiastically. The Methani, in particular, found in humanity a kindred spirit, a species that valued individual expression over collective harmony, that celebrated difference rather than suppressing it. Within a generation, Methani artists were creating works that would have been unthinkable under the old order, and Methani engineers were pushing the boundaries of what technology could achieve.
The greatest changes, however, occurred in the most unexpected place, among the humans themselves.
The colonists of the Hope of Humanity established the first human settlement on Proxima Centauri B, a world they named New Hope. But they did not remain isolated. As other human vessels arrived, as communication with Earth became more regular, as the Concordat's resources became available to human scientists and entrepreneurs, the scope of human ambition expanded dramatically.
Within 50 years, there were human settlements on a dozen worlds. Within a century, that number had grown to 100. Humans spread through the galaxy like wildfire, adapting to environments that other species had dismissed as uninhabitable, finding resources that others had overlooked, creating communities that reflected every aspect of human diversity.
And everywhere they went, they changed things. A human mining operation on an asteroid in Valen space developed a new extraction technique that doubled the efficiency of ore processing, then shared the technology freely with their hosts. A human research station near a black hole made discoveries about the nature of gravity that overturned centuries of accepted physics.
A human cultural center on a singing stone world created art forms that combine human emotion with crystalline precision, producing works that moved beings of silicon and carbon alike. Not all the changes were positive. Human conflicts sometimes spilled over into Concordat space, requiring mediation and sometimes forceful intervention. Human businesses sometimes engaged in practices that older civilizations found distasteful or unethical. Human settlers sometimes clashed with indigenous populations over resources and territory.
But even the conflicts served a purpose.
They forced the Concordat to develop new mechanisms for dispute resolution, new frameworks for managing diverse populations, new ways of thinking about problems that had no precedent in galactic history.
The galaxy was changing, and humanity was the catalyst.
It was nearly 200 years after the first signal from Earth, 200 years after Senior Monitor Krelveth had detected a snippet of human music and changed the course of galactic history, that an expedition reached the heart of the quarantine zone. The expedition was led by a joint human Concordat team, authorized by the unified council that now governed both civilizations. Their mission, to explore the ancient architect ruins and discover why the precursor species had vanished so suddenly 8,000 years ago.
Dr. Sarah Chen, the expedition's chief archaeologist, was the first to enter the primary archive, a vast underground complex that had remained sealed since the architect's disappearance. What she found there changed everything.
The archives contained the complete history of the architect civilization, recorded in formats that human and Concordat scientists worked together to decode. And in those records, they discovered the truth about the Great Silence.
The architects had not vanished, they had transcended.
Their civilization had reached a point of such advancement that physical existence was no longer necessary or desirable. They had developed the ability to upload their consciousness into a form of existence beyond matter and energy, a realm of pure thought that transcended the limitations of the material universe.
But before they left, they had done one final thing. They had seeded the galaxy with potential. They had created the conditions for new sapient species to emerge, hoping that those species would eventually follow the same path, would eventually join them in the realm beyond.
The Concordat had been one result of this seeding, a community of species that developed under careful guidance, following the path the architects had laid out for them. Stable, peaceful, sustainable, but ultimately limited. The Concordat species were destined to remain in the material universe forever, never advancing beyond a certain point, never quite reaching the threshold that would allow them to transcend.
Humanity was a different result. The architects had seeded Earth with the same potential as other worlds, but something had gone wrong, or perhaps something had gone right. Humanity had not followed the expected path. They had developed in ways the architects had not anticipated, had resisted every attempt at guidance, had insisted on finding their own way.
And in doing so, they had developed something the Concordat species lacked: the capacity to grow beyond any limit, to adapt to any challenge, to refuse to accept any boundary as final. The architects had not fled from humanity out of fear. They had fled because they recognized what humanity represented, the first species with the potential to actually achieve transcendence on their own terms, without guidance, without control, without the careful management that had defined the architect's approach to development.
They had fled because they knew that when humanity finally reached for the stars, everything would change, not just for humanity, but for the entire galaxy. The old order would crumble. The carefully maintained stability would give way to chaos and growth. Species that had been content in their stagnation would be forced to either evolve or fade away. And they had been right. The message the architects left behind was not a warning to run from humanity. It was a warning to prepare for what humanity would bring.
When the humans reach for the stars, the final record stated, the galaxy must know, the time of preparation is over. The time of transformation has begun. Either embrace the change or be left behind. There is no third option. There never was. Dr. Chen shared the discovery with the expedition team, who shared it with the council, who shared it with the galaxy. And for the first time, the various species of the Concordat understood what they had been so afraid of.
It wasn't that humanity would destroy them. It wasn't that humanity would conquer them.
It was that humanity would force them to grow.
500 years after the first signal from Earth. The galaxy was unrecognizable from the one that had existed before humanity's emergence. The Concordat still existed, but it had transformed into something far more dynamic than its founders had ever envisioned. The old restrictions on development had been abandoned. Competition between species was not just permitted, but encouraged. Innovation happened at rates that would have seemed impossible in the old order.
Human influence was everywhere, in the art, the technology, the philosophy, the very way beings thought about themselves and their place in the universe. But humanity had been changed in turn, absorbing ideas and perspectives from dozens of species, becoming something more than they had been when they first reached for the stars.
The triumvirate of ash had eventually emerged from isolation, forced out by internal pressures from younger members who demanded to participate in the galaxy's transformation. Their integration was difficult, their adjustment painful, but they had ultimately found their place in the new order.
Even the singing stones, the most ancient and contemplative species in the Concordat, had embraced the change. Their elders spoke of the period since humanity's emergence as the most interesting and challenging time in their entire history, a time that had forced them to reconsider assumptions they had held for millions of years.
And in the archives of the Architect ruins, new discoveries continued to be made. Scientists from across the galaxy worked together to unlock the secrets of transcendence, to understand the path the architects had taken and determine whether other species could follow.
The first transcendence event occurred 497 years after the first signal from Earth. It happened not to a human, but to a being from a species that had been considered the most primitive and undeveloped in the Concordat, a species that had been uplifted less than a century earlier and should have been millennia away from such achievement.
But they had learned from humanity. They had absorbed the human approach to problems, attack them directly, fail fast, learn faster. They had embraced the human refusal to accept limits, the human belief that anything was possible if you tried hard enough and refused to give up.
And they had achieved what the Concordat's careful, controlled development had never allowed.
Humanity celebrated the achievement as a vindication of everything they represented. The Concordat celebrated it as proof that the transformation had succeeded. The transcended being itself, now existing in a realm beyond physical comprehension, sent back a message that echoed across the galaxy.
"Tell them we were right to be afraid," it said. "But tell them also that fear is not the enemy. Stagnation is the enemy. Complacency is the enemy. The belief that the way things are is the way things must always be, that is the true threat to survival. Embrace change. Embrace growth. Embrace the unknown. That is the path to transcendence. That is the path to becoming something greater than what you were."
The message was carved into monuments across 1,000 worlds. It was taught in schools to children of every species. It became the unofficial motto of the new galactic civilization. And it all traced back to a single moment, 500 years earlier, when a monitoring station in the outer spiral arm had detected a fragment of music drifting through space, a signal that announced to the galaxy that humanity was awake and reaching for the stars.
The galaxy had detected a human signal, and pure panic had followed. But the panic had given way to understanding. The understanding had given way to acceptance. The acceptance had given way to embrace. And the embrace had given way to transformation. In the end, humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had not destroyed it. They had not even really changed it, in the sense of imposing their will upon it.
They had simply reminded it what was possible.
They had reminded it that growth was better than stagnation, that risk was better than complacency, that reaching for the stars, even when you didn't know what you would find, was better than never reaching at all.
They had reminded the galaxy that fear was not a reason to hide, but a sign that something important was at stake.
And the galaxy had listened.
1,000 years after the first signal from Earth, Dr. Kira Chen, direct descendant of Sarah Chen through 20 generations of spacefaring ancestors,
stood on the observation deck of the research station orbiting Sol. Earth hung before her, a blue-green jewel that was now one of thousands of human-inhabited worlds, but still held a special place in the hearts of her species.
She was here for a very special purpose. 1,000 years ago, her ancestors had sent a signal into space, music, greetings, images of their world, hoping that someone would hear. That signal had triggered a transformation that reshaped the galaxy. Now, finally, they had received a response. It came from beyond the galaxy, from a realm that sensors could barely detect and instruments could not properly measure. It came from the architects, who had transcended 8,000 years ago, but had never truly left, had simply been watching, waiting, hoping that their seeding of the galaxy would eventually bear fruit.
The message was simple, a single phrase that needed no translation because it was transmitted directly into the minds of every sapient being in the galaxy, regardless of species or language or level of development.
Welcome to the next stage of existence. You have passed the test. The universe is bigger than you ever imagined, and you have proven that you are ready to explore it. Come, there is so much more to learn.
Kira Chen felt tears on her face, an ancient human expression of emotion that had spread to dozens of species over the past millennium. Around her, beings of crystal and energy and flesh stood in shared wonder, united by a moment that their ancestors could never have imagined. The panic that had gripped the galaxy 1,000 years ago was long forgotten. The fear that humanity had inspired was now a footnote in history books, a reminder of how wrong assumptions could lead to almost catastrophic mistakes.
What remained was something far more important, a galaxy that had learned to embrace its own potential, that had stopped being afraid of change and started reaching for the impossible.
Humanity had taught them that, not through conquest or domination, but through example, through refusing to accept limits, through reaching for the stars even when no one believed they could succeed.
And now, together, they were about to reach even further. "Prepare the transcendence protocols," Kira said, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. "It's time to see what comes next." The research station hummed with activity as beings from a dozen species moved to carry out her orders. In the distance, the sun that had warmed humanity's cradle shone with the same light it had cast for billions of years, indifferent to the chaos and transformation its third planet had unleashed upon the galaxy. But the beings who had evolved beneath that light were no longer confined to its warmth. They had spread to the stars, carried their fire to distant worlds, and ignited the same spark in species that had been content to remain static for millennia. The galaxy had detected a human signal, and pure panic had followed. But in the end, the signal had not been a threat. It had been an invitation, and the galaxy had finally accepted.